What I'm going to do today is trying to explore with you what we can do with data visualization aesthetics when we have to compose rich visual narrative in static images mostly, but also the difference regarding this topic when we have the possibility to build interactive data visualization. And yeah, I'll talk about the work that we've been doing at Accurate, which is, as Liz was introducing, the company, the Italian information design company that I co-founded 2 years ago. And our main office is in Milan, but now we opened an office in New York. It's still a smaller place, Mark, but we are working on making it bigger. So basically, just to give you a bit of introduction for who guys don't know us, we actually gather data and analyze data, and we design data visualization and visual narratives, but also we design and develop analytical and interactive tools like web or mobile interfaces and applications to get big system of information, to access big system of information through. And in the company, we have very different backgrounds, and we really rely on that in how we work on our projects. So far we are around 20 people, interaction designers, graphic designers, but also developers and content curators. And as you might see from this kind of composition, really the core is design and visual storytelling with data. And starting to defining a little bit what we think of our work in a few words, I would say that mostly we try to act as a visual bridge between the data and the people who cannot really dig into the data. And we try to help them understanding, shaping the ways, the visual ways that people access this information. But today I will basically focus on two projects that specifically uses data visualization to convey stories. The first one is a data journalistic project that we've been doing for more than a year so far for the Sunday cultural supplement of Corriere della Sera, which is the main Italian newspaper. And we regularly publish on the newspaper, and as you can see from these previews, they are quite rich in compound visual narratives, and I have to tell you that they are done pretty much manually, so really passing from spreadsheet to Adobe Illustrator in this kind of thing. And the second project that I will show you is an interactive one, and then we'll see a little bit about the differences. It's a visual digital access to the Crunchbase database, which is a public database that collects information on the startups around the world. And I'll show you really the difference in designing this visual when it comes to static and interactive. But let's get started with the old-fashioned printed one. So La Lettura is how the supplement is called, and it can be translated in English like the very act of reading, so spending time reading. And what we do here is that we every time choose a topic that we want to explore. Sometimes it's just a fascination that we have, or some other times it's just like data set that we find. We combine the data set and we try to find the most interesting way to tell the stories. And purposely here, we aim at composing rich visual narratives, maintaining the informative richness of the data, but still making this richness more accessible through visualization. And we call what we do here, and then I'll dig a little bit in some of the projects, we call this kind of storytelling as a multi-layer storytelling, with a first story that should be visually very clear at a first glance, but then that can also lead readers to get like in depth in finding some tangential stories. And I think that for us here, the very challenge is to think about the data as journalists rather than analysts, and so really asking ourselves, what's interesting about this number, and what if I mesh it up with something else, and how can I fit several stories in just one page? And visually speaking, as you might have seen from these previews, also we really try to build customized visual models for our pieces. So experimenting a little bit with non-common standards visual metaphor for the data that we are analyzing. Okay, I'll present two pieces that we did for La Lettura. In this one, the phenomena of the so-called brain drain is explored through a visualization that is displaying the main income and outcome of researchers' flow for 16 countries and discovering correlation with other parameters. And you have to imagine that these pieces are really meant to be printed that big, and so people can really physically dig into the data. So I hope that you guys can get the details, but in case they are online, just like follow me on how we build it and why we did some design choices. just to give you a bit of a context, here the countries which are this compound element that you see are positioned within the main architecture of the visualization according to two factors. So horizontally, the GDP that each country dedicates to the research and development field, and vertically the number of researchers per million people. So the very first story, the very first point of view on the data set, you have it with the positioning of the countries, and you can really just like see how countries are positioned in different way and so performing in different way. But then each country is really displayed by contrasting lots of parameters and information that helps discover its total situation in terms of how many researchers go abroad, which is the solid red histogram going down, and how many enter the country, which is the blue solid one going up. And also how many are coming back after a period abroad, which is the orange small line that is going up again compared to the red one. But these are not enough information to understand what's happening in this country. So we also chose to include data about the regular population, emigration and immigration, which are the hollow red and blue histogram, very close to the researchers, emigration and immigration, and also the GDP per capita, which is the light bubble dimension behind the name of the country, and also the main countries where researchers come from and go into, the main university rankings, which is the green dot up above, and the unemployment rate in the country, which is the yellow squares dimension. And the last one that we find interesting is the female employment rate, which is the pink line. So this is a very rich narrative, very full of information, but we did include all of the information to provide some possible correlations. And all of the things that you see, all of the data that you see are percentages, so that you can really visually compare the trends and not the value per se. And coming back to our job as a visual designer in this way, of course, this is not the definitive and ultimate point of view on the global brain drain phenomena. It's just one possible interpretation of it. It's one possible view on the topic, and we hope that readers can really find their interpretation on that. And visually speaking, here we don't have big data. We cannot really talk about big data, but still we have lots of different kinds of information we correlated. And also to us, that we analyze the data, really the patterns emerge just once visualized. As an example, we can see from the piece that in general the researchers move around much more than the average person. In fact, for almost each country, the red and blue solid histogram, which are the researchers, are longer than the hollowed ones. We see that we have some exceptions in Latin countries like Spain and Italy. In fact, there seems to be important proportionally more regular workers, so say with lower level of education rather than researchers. And we can also see that the countries that attract many researchers, so the filled blue bars, are also normally the ones that attract more foreigners. And so now we start looking at the situation and asking ourselves why. It seems not to be so much a question of GDP per capita, which still is the light bubble behind the name of the country. The percentage, the presence, on top university, which is the green dot, it's important but not essential. The best countries seems really to be the ones with a high female employment rate, and also if you see from the name of the country, maybe the country where people normally speak English, like Canada, Great Britain, and the US. Another peculiarity is that the countries that drive out the researchers the most, which are the one highlighted here with a long red solid histogram, are not necessarily the one afflicted by economical crises such as high unemployment or low incomes. As an example, you can see that Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Belgium, they export many researchers, even if they have a very low unemployment rate, which is the yellow square dimension, in a very high average income. But here we're back with the overall again. And again, of course, this is an incredible rich visual piece full of information, and as a reader, you are supposed to spend time getting that and finding your own stories, the stories that you want to understand. And the visual design choices that we made should help to find potential correlations. And of course, the aim of producing a visual piece of this kind is to convey effective way to understand correlation and phenomena, and we have to be very straightforward in that when we are representing data. But we also, everybody know how it is important also to try to produce beautiful pieces, unexpected, aesthetic, to try to catch reader eyes and make readers say, oh, this is beautiful, I want to understand that. And this is true, moreover, today with the world very full of infographic and data visualization. And so how can you make sure that your pieces are, in a way, remembered? I don't have a kind of universal rule, but we have our personal method, which is basically getting visual inspirations not from actual data visualization, but from whatever else. As an example, the visual idea behind the brain drain piece that you've seen before actually came to me after a visit to the MoMA Inventing Abstraction exhibition, which happened last year, and it was very fascinating. And this visit happened actually during the first day that we were analyzing the data on the researchers and on the researchers in the country. And during the visit at MoMA, I was really, and I have to be honest, I was really wishing to come up with a data visualization able to replicate the geometrical feeling and the pleasant aesthetics and primary color that I was passing through. And then each country started immediately to appear to me as a kind of compound element with parameters displayed as the very geometrical shapes I was sketching down during the visit. Well, also, yeah, I also think that it's interesting when you see some images that you really like to kind of start to redraw, so that you can start to convey them your personal take on that. And so yeah, these are just like the first sketches exploring the parameters related to the country in this kind of geometrical way. And just to share you also from the very beginning to how we shape the data visualization, here in this stage I was just trying to understand how this inspiration could help in deciding how to represent the parameters of the country. Of course, according to the analysis that we did and what we wanted to put in evidence, so for this particular story. And yeah, here the stage where elements start to have been done digitally and have their shape, and really I wanted to keep this experiment with primary colors as Mondrian was teaching a lot. And here we are with the final one, and I guess you can totally spot how this kind of modern paintings, visual inspiration played its role on the piece. This is another visualization, actually the one that Liz was talking about, featured in the magazine. And it explores Nobel Prizes and laureates from 1901 to 2012. So the last round of Nobel Prizes in 2013 is not included, unfortunately. And yeah, I'll just spin a little bit on that, and then I'll go to see insights and inspiration even for this piece. So we visualize the prize categories along these timelines with these kind of parallel scores with the 6 main rows highlighted by colors. And so we have red for chemistry, blue for economic science, green for physics, yellow for literature, purple for medicine, and orange for peace, if you cannot read it on the back of the room. And so each dot that you see here represents a Nobel laureate, and each guy is positioned according to the year the prize was awarded, of course in the timeline, and also his or her age at the time of the award, which are the vertical positioning within each category. So in a way, highlighting as a first story, how old should you be to win the prize? And also per each category we draw a line indicating the average age for the category, which is the colored one, and also the average age for the total of the laureate, which is always the black dashed one, so that you can really compare the categories among them all, but still one to the other, and really understand how they perform within the total of the Nobel laureates. And then we use the main axis of the visualization that we already provided with the first stories to provide some aggregated information. And the arcs that you can see here represent the principal university of affiliation of Nobel per each category. And it's interesting that chemistry, physics, and medicine, which are red, green, and purple, are spread among the 7 main universities, while literature and peace Nobel Prizes, which are the yellow and orange, quite didn't attend the top university. And you can really see it once visualized. Imagine to have all of this data in a spreadsheet. It's really impractical to find patterns on that. And also the bar charts here within the 2 parentheses represent the average grade level per category, so if PhD or not even degreed. And you can learn that if you want a Nobel in medicine, economics, or physics, well, you should seriously think about a PhD, but you can try without that for literature and peace, which are the yellow and orange one, which you can see that had lots of laureates that are not even degreed. And the double rounded dot that you see here represent the women out of the total, which are not so many. And I think that design-wise, this is important. So we didn't really differentiate the men and the women with two different symbols. We gave for granted that all the guys without a double symbol, they are men, and we only highlighted the women, which if you have to present lots of information, you have to be able to understand which ones could be in a way visually cut out and which one still makes sense. And so this part below represents the most frequent hometowns out of the total, of course, still using the timeline of the main visualization and just aggregating 30 years of information. And so it's interesting that lately, if you're born in the US, you are more likely to catch the prize, while at the beginning of the century, the most of the scene was European. And we also have some, let's say, curiosities highlighted, so some primates and particularly relevant information that we found. So some very personal story that we wanted to highlight with the text, like Marie Curie, that she won 2 Nobel Prizes, or the oldest winner that was 90 and the youngest that was 24, and so on. And of course, we recalled the numbers within the visualization to really point out where and when this happened. And this is the how to read it part. When we use, again, the visualization itself to, the visualization may shape as a base to give readers information about how to play around. And this is very important, like to add a key or a legend when you're trying to convey information in novel visual ways. And so it is the visualization itself, even here, customized for the data that we analyze that can help spot patterns. Some of them we've already seen before, but in general, we can also say that lately Nobel Prizes are older if compared to the decades before. Or also we have concentration of women in medicine and peace particularly, which are the 2 rows at the bottom. And also this is something that always surprised me. There is a maybe expected gap of prizes during the Second World War, and this is pretty visible, and you know, we could imagine that, but when you realize it visually, isn't it stronger? In coming to the visual inspiration again, even here, it wasn't really a data visualization that inspired us and that inspired me. I've been, just like by myself, always very visually fascinated from the musical scores and their elegant aesthetics. And many times I would just like find myself drawing and replicating this kind of this kind of musical-like shapes with no purpose at all. And also, I really visually love the so-called graphic music notation, which is the contemporary music notation that uses non-traditional symbols and colors to convey information about a performance of a piece of music and express what and how should be played. And John Cage is a famous contemporary composer, and his visual exploration on contemporary score are really fascinating. And I think that I don't need to add anything more. Can you spot similarities with the visualization that I was showing before and this kind of visual music notation? And again, just to go from the inspiration to the piece, these were the first sketches when I was trying to simply follow the idea of building those parallel scores, highlighting some differences that we noticed within the data. And then the visualization was pretty clear to me. The idea of really using the main timeline of the visualization to then provide aggregated information per category and per time. And these are intermediate stages when we started doing it digitally. And actually for this piece, lots of people asked us why we rotated the visualization, so why it is turned a little bit like on a slope. And to be honest, the lack of a space of the artboard at the very beginning played its role on the choice when we were trying to fit all of the data into a page. But then, when we tried this kind of rotation while fitting everything to the artboard, so isn't it just like more incredibly elegant? I couldn't even tell why, but it's more elegant. It's more like, you know, given the sense of evolution. And so we were like, that's okay, let's keep it like that. And here we are back again with the whole structure of the piece finalized. Okay, let's try to learn something from that. As I was introducing before, we call the pieces that you've seen here multi-layer storytelling. And of course, to build effective pieces of this kind, everything has to fold around the concept of layering, establishing hierarchies, and making sure that these hierarchies are clear. And this is the case for us for both the data analysis and the visual composition. And I try to explain how we normally do for this paper I've been asked to write for the Parsons Journal for Information Mapping in this article called Nonlinear Storytelling Journalism through Infospatial Composition. I didn't choose the title, but it's nice anyway. And it is basically a dissection of our pieces from how they start to how they evolve in terms of visual composition. And we just try to derive general principles and some intermediate stages that we could name. And I won't really go in depth on that. You can find the article online. But if we want to somehow group the whole process of ours in point, we could explain them like composing the main architecture of the visualization. So which are the main principles of the spatial organization of the story? And then positioning each singular elements within the main framework. So each singular data point finds its location within the piece. And then now each element assumes a shape, a dimension, and a feature according to the characteristic that we want to highlight. If we happen to find interesting relationship or groups within the data, once we visualize the basic data point, we might need to elucidate these internal relationships. And then we start labeling and identifying elements if we need to have some text. And then, very important, supplementing the greater story through the addition of secondary stories, the other correlations that we want to include, the other background information that we want to add to the story. And of course, all of these are just like schematization. There are no data behind it. Everything is fake. It's just like to abstract the process of building of the piece in the slides. And then we, of course, provide visual explanations such as a legend or a key. And at the very end, we fine-tune and stylize element shapes, color, and weights to really make sure that hierarchies can pop up. And you know, little things can really make a difference. So just like labeling a legend or a fine-tuning of strokes, lines, opacity of elements, something that maybe people don't even notice really, but it's very fundamental with so many information layers. Yeah, of course, the process is not that linear as it could seem from this point. It's a constant iteration of exploration, and we really make no claim to have settled any universal method. It's just ours derived from our different backgrounds in the attitudes. And in a way, it's our method to try to reach interactivity even in static pieces. But what if we have the possibility to really work with interaction? How things changes? As I was introducing, this one is visual access to the Crunchbase database, which is a public database that collects information on startups all around the world. This tool that we designed is online and available, so all of you can play with it. And we designed it with the aim of highlighting relationships in terms of time and money among venture capitalists, startups, and founders. Here is a video of the navigation. Yeah. So actually, you can either enter a query on the upper part of the visualization if you already know what you're looking for, or you can browse startups from the menu. And then you jump to the main scene of the visualization when you can see how much money each startup earned per each round, which is the size of the internal circle, and the total of the money, which is the size of the whole circles. And then jump into seeing which venture capitalists put money on that and understanding which other startups the venture capitalists funded. And when you find some guys that really funded lots of startups, you can also act on the timeline and really narrowing down the period in order to be able to better compare what's happening in this kind of period. And so the idea is to have this kind of view when you can easily jump from venture capitalist startups and founders and explore the relationship. But also, as you can see, you always have the information on the Crunchbase database and the links to access their website and their information on the bottom. And so it is really a visual access to the information, the more quantitative information that you can have on the website. And so this was very quick, but of course, static pieces and interactive visualization are very different in terms of how not only in terms of how many information and so the amount of information that you can display at once, but also because of the fact that with interactive pieces, we as designers, we could really try to let people explore and find their own path through data without really having to pick a point of view, without really having to act as a curators. And So wrapping up what I went through before and starting to conclude this kind of exploration, I really like this definition that Maurice Stefaner, which is a very brilliant data visualizer, have about data visualization. So good visualization not only answer questions, they generate new questions, they make you think in concern. Good visualization should tell stories. 1,000 stories able to provide, if done good, multiple layers of exploration. And I know that I showed some compound and complex pieces today, but talking about complexity, which I think it's an important point to make. So yeah, whenever the main purpose of the visualization is to open readers' eyes to new knowledge, or to reveal something new about the world, or also to engage the audience, entertain the audience about the topic, it's really kind of impractical to avoid certain levels of visual complexity. Because actually the world is complex, is compound. We every day run into lots of information that we can combine in endless way. And therefore, catching new points of view and discovering something that you didn't know before often cannot really happen at a glance. And this kind of process of knowing and revelation in all of the aspects of our lives require an in-depth investigation of the context. So we like to think a data visualization like visual way to convey the richness and involvement and feelings, being like engagement, concerns, or whatever kind of information that we experience in our everyday life on the story that we run into, rather than a simplification of the words. And yeah, talking a little bit more about how we design, how we shape these ways. These are just pieces starting from the sketches and becoming actual data visualization, so that you can just like enjoy some comparison what I'm trying to conclude my talk. So through this visual exploration, we really constantly try to create harmonious composition, maintaining and respecting the complexity of the data that we are analyzing, and those building customized visual models, as I call them, customized, and possibly also different and experimental all the time. And the thing is that we do know that there is a science to data visualization, or at least that recognized principles about how to represent information exist and are, I'd say, are worth to be pursued in many, many times. So really many times regular bar charts, scatter plots, timelines, and maps are the best way to convey information. But to us, it simply doesn't mean that this is an end, that everything is already settled and concluded, and there's no room for experimenting. And this is really the exploratory goal that we have behind all of these projects. In a way, we believe that keeping on exploring the realm of possibility, even passing through failures and mistakes and weird composition, can also lead up to refining and perfecting the core of this kind of field in science. We are just like testing and exploring how to push forward and create new visual language. And also, I know that is a very high aim, but we also hope that we can educate readers' eyes. You know, educate is a bad word in English, I think, but you know, make readers' eyes more comfortable with new aesthetics and visual languages and visual, visual conventions, new visual conventions. And so, in a way, successful aesthetic design should on data visualization should balance conventions in so familiar forms that people are already comfortable with, and novelty. Novelty like imaginative visual, able to attract readers into the exploration because they see something that they haven't seen before. And when you try to add something new or picking inspiration from different field, I think that we as designer, you as designer, you have to remember how our brain works in terms of like finding meaning towards finding meaning they already know in things, in this case visual meanings and visual conventions. And everything is about metaphor, I think. And if we really want to explore and experiment and risk, we have to build and frame in a way our pieces around something and relying on something that has been experienced before. Being something like, okay, I can experiment, but I can provide the basic layout of the visualization with regular timelines or with kind of grid that people are already familiar with. Something able to transform the strange into the known. And yeah, I think that basically the question here right now in this nowadays world full of data visualization, the question to set is how far can we go? And I don't know, but we try to find ways to get there in a way. And I think that's it. I don't know if it was too short, I was too quick, but yeah, this was the basic idea of today. And yeah, I also have here my partner at Accurate, which is Gabriel, right there. So if you want to ask questions to us, please. Thank you. I have a
What
microphone.
software do you use to create the visual designs?
Actually, the first one that you saw are really created manually, passing from spreadsheet like Excel to Adobe Illustrator. They're very manually because, I mean, we have developers in our company, and I'm not a technological person, I cannot code at all, so I'm just like the designer, but for the startup universe, and so the second piece that I show, the second project, of course we use D3 and we like coded and programmed, but all of the pieces that you saw at the beginning are done very manually. In this, basically because we really want to customize the visual models, and so not starting from the standards that tools or already codified languages can provide us with, but in this experimental project we really wanted to explore. And also, I think that I didn't mention that, but the visualization for Corriere della Sera, we do it in a very short time span. Like, imagine that from the very beginning to the end, like from the data gathering, it passed something like 6 days and not more. So, I mean, sometimes we don't even have the time to program. We just have to say, that's okay, we want to visualize this like that, and we do it in Illustrator. So, yeah.
I guess I'm curious how you might think of your process versus a magazine article. Whereas an article, you have a journalist who's doing research and writing up a first draft, but then an editor comes in and helps sort of shape the story that's being told. Do you have an editor who's coming in and sort of looking at your graphic and saying, that data point doesn't really help tell the story, or helping you understand what the original data should be?
Sure. Yeah, this is an interesting question. Actually, the other partner that we have in the company, he's a sociologist. So in a way, he has a kind of more humanistic, it's not a journalist, but he has this kind of, you know, background in picking the right data, picking the right criteria through which display the data. But we have a publisher, which sometimes act like an editor. I think that the main, let's say, tricky part with them is to find data set that they can recognize as institutionalized. So for our publisher, as an example, even if we find very interesting to add a layer of information, say coming from Wikipedia or from popular choices like, you know, blog and forums, we cannot do that because they are the main Italian newspaper and they cannot rely on this data. So I think that mostly our publisher act as censoring in a way, like, you know, and not really helping us in saying, oh, but you could also have this kind of data set. We do it by ourselves, and we know that we are not journalists, and so we are not pretending to have, as I was saying before, the ultimate point of view on a phenomena. Actually, the visualization that you see, this kind of visualization, are always when you see the visualization on the newspaper, you always have an article written by a journalist interpreting the visual. So basically, it's not just the visualization itself, but it is a visualization plus an article. So maybe if we miss something as just a visual designer, sometimes the article could provide an help on that. But basically, it's just us finding out which are the parameters that we want to add to the story and how to compare them. And this is how we work. Yeah. That's okay. Oh, another question?
I was wondering how you come up with your story in the first place. You know, you mentioned in your process you lay out the main framework and you decide where the elements go inside that story, and then you start laying on the secondary ones. But do you just start asking questions and seeing what comes out of the data?
It really depends. Sometimes the bigger part is really to analyze the data, and so we have some guys in the office. I'm not analyzing the data. We have our data analyst and Simone, who is a sociologist, that start in combining information to the spreadsheet and really manually looking if we could spot some interesting patterns or something that are worth to tell the main stories. And then sometimes it happens like that, and then we build the visual models according to the thing that we already know in data. Some other times, and this is interesting, we can have a fascination about how to visualize a topic even without having the data yet. So really something like, why don't we visualize this like this? And it's just like imagining that you can find some data, imagining that you can find a story in the data, but sometimes the visual highlighting come even before the actual data analysis. And of course, I think that this is usually a jumping point to the story, and then when we find the data, we can also come up finding that the patterns are not the one that we expected, and then we change the visual models. But I think that it really, really depends. And sometimes the main story is something that is really in the data, so you say, that's okay, this is something that I have to represent, like in the Nobel Prizes. Of course, we could have picked whatever first visual information and first story, but we decided to choose the age of the laureates at the main jumping point. And so yeah, sometimes the story is in the data, sometimes the visualization is a representation of a phenomena where people can then look for their patterns, and it really, really varies for us. And I think that it also is so variable, and also because we really have a very short time span. So every time we have to figure out how to do it in 6 days. So if we have a visual idea, we pursue this idea. If we have a data set, we try to start from the data set. So the short time span, I think that is an interesting constraint, because you have to get something delivered for that day. And you have also to have, I know that I'm going also a little bit further from the original question, but also I think that the constraints, like the graphic constraints, and you can see this very annoying pink background and the fixed artboard, and just the fact that you can use one font, but it's still very interesting because you can then just focus on how to compose the visual piece, and you're not distracted about how to compose the layout, which kind of fonts to use. And I think that also it gives the overall of the visualization this kind of aesthetic of being a series in a way. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question in the first place.
Hi. At my job, we tend to struggle a bit with the balance between explanation and exploration. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, and how do you approach it, especially for the more in-depth interactive work?
Sure. Yeah, you're totally right. I think that my point today, I don't know if it was so clear at the beginning, but was really to show you how we can explore and experiment. And so this was the reason why I chose to really show this exploratory project. As a company, we do lots of other more straightforward visuals that it depends from the aim. I mean, when you have to produce a visual that has to be useful for decision-making purposes, or something that has to be in a way very scientifical, I think that the flexibility and the possibility to explore is a little bit less. In this project that is like a column called Visual Data on a Sunday cultural supplement of a newspaper that is meant to be a long read for people, we have, as it's mandatory, like for us, from our publisher, to really explore. I think that the balancing between exploration and explanation depends on the goal of the project, and the goal of the project at hand, the goal of the client, the kind of information that the readers or the users are expecting to see, and the kind of story that they're expecting to see. I think that there is no single answer. It really depends on your goals, on the goals of the specific project. What do you think?
Our goals are different for every project.
Likewise,
Yeah.
exactly.
But
So.
sometimes there's maybe an implied pressure for people to get it like that, which is, I know you were talking about that earlier.
Yeah.
If it's too much exploration, the viewer might feel overwhelmed. But if you explain too much, you might not get
I know.
reason to come back.
I know, and this is why we try to layer our visual so that eventually, hopefully, there's something that you can get at a glance, like the topic or something that you as a reader are particularly interested in to explore, and then if you have time, you can go in depth. And I think that it's interesting here, a sentence that sometimes I use from Sean Carter, which is the designer of the New York Times, and it's very interesting because he talks about designing for a Bart Simpson and a Lisa Simpson of the world. So when the Bart Simpson is the guy that just want to have a quick look, a quick fix, and then walk away and flip away, but then on the same piece, you may also encounter a Lisa Simpson that want to stay there and understand everything and get into details. And so I think that this is an interesting way of thinking about your audience, because with a singular piece, you can really you can really give this kind of piece to people that have different willings to understand and to explore. And I think there is no a singular answer to your question. I don't know, Gabriel, if you want to add anything. Not really. Okay.
What is your mixture of clients? Is it really just for the more magazine journalists, or you have like
No.
just regular corporate clients? and
Yeah,
things
we
like
have very different clients. Like we work with the financial sector, and so really people that have to visualize financial data. We work with lots of banks, both for their communication, and so like visualizing data for their clients or their public, maybe to show their philosophy of saving and something, but also for their internal scopes. Like we also build analytical visual tools for them to get better understanding of internal dynamics of people, internal dynamics of data. And so basically for the financial sector, we are doing this kind of job. Then we work for lots of foundation and also libraries, like the New York City Public Library as an example. So institutions that have more qualitative data, and so data based on text. For them, we are now visualizing a very compelling data set on the correspondences between the founding father of the US. And so, yeah, also this kind of more cultural institutions. We've been working for the healthcare system in Italy, also designing visual interfaces that was able in a more visual way to convey not really to convey information, but to make patients, relatives, and different kind of doctors talk about the same medical record. And so our work there was to start from the already existing digital medical record, which are basically very complicated right now in their interfaces, and just making the interfaces more intuitive for different kind of users. And so the interface for the patient would be different rather than the one for the client, for the doctor, and the relative, of course. And yeah, I think that we also, we work with big consultancies to help them, consultancy company, helping them shaping the way they communicate with their clients about the client's data. It really varies. And I think that it's interesting because we can really crosswise in the field and work with experts in the field, which is really very interesting to us because every time we learn from them. And we just like act as the information designer, which is our role.
And you opened the New York office because you're moving into more American clients or North American clients?
Yeah, actually it was the other way around. So basically we wanted to explore if it was possible for us to get, let me be honest. We really wanted to try to see how was the scene in New York, because we felt from Italy that, I mean, in Italy we are, it's a very small market and we are kind of like little number of people doing this kind of job. So from a certain point of view, we have all of the market in Italy. So we are like the top Italian company doing that just because we are basically the only ones. And so we are very happy with Italy because we can do whatever. We can publish with the main Italian newspaper. Imagine that is like the New York Times, like that. But then we really felt that the scene was somewhere else. And so we tried to stay here for 3-6 months in really like exploratory mode with no real business strategies or marketing strategies. But then clients and publication came by themselves. So we didn't really even have to look for them. Just the fact of being here in this kind of very connected environment. And I think that New York is also particular and very unique. Now, I mean, I've not been traveling that much in the US, but I think the energy and the possibility to meet people and to run into people that are interesting for your job are super high here. And so then we decided that we had, of course, to try to open an office here, and now, yeah, we are here. Thank you all.